Thank you very much for helping out with section 1 today and recording.
It's all right.
That'll be
Sorry I'm
much
late.
appreciated. Oh, good Lord. Yeah. No, it's all right. The start, we're actually early.
Yeah,
I said 13:55 for a 1400
Yeah, I had to
start.
let the dog back in, and now I'm gonna go and get my coffee. So be quiet for 1 minute.
Can't you just press record?
I have.
You have?
Yes.
All right. Well, so you can check this bit out later.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can catch up. You can, but I will start off. Go on, give me 2 minutes. Go on. I'll ask any other questions as well whilst we're waiting, that we are on record. I will look at the text wall just quickly. Quite keen to get this bit done in half an hour, which is going to be a bit of a struggle. So we can actually choose the topic ourselves and so on. Yes, those topics will be outlined very clearly. So it will be a choice, but that could mean that you could also be talking about, when we talk about text and culture, you could also be talking about picture books, of course. And that's the whole idea. So we've got a whole range, recognizing the fact that perhaps the diaries and novels, which we can say they are as well, that characterize the 5 to 10 reading are maybe not exactly what you'll be doing in primary, or if you are, you'll be adapting things heavily as well. So there's a potential there to also be discussing the picture books, definitely. And you will be allowed to prepare, therefore. If you're going to use any sources, you'll be able to then give us a reading list in case there are other things that you're going to bring up that we need to prepare before. And you can, as Kristen points out there as well, if you can be prepared and you can basically go on to talk about other issues. If you can talk for 20 minutes in a structured way, you are leading, so that will be fine. If you dry up, then obviously it will be left to the examiners to lead. So we'll do practice on this. The idea is to, really boss the exam zone is my idea. Anyway, it's coming up to 2 o'clock and I'm faithfully told we're recording. In fact, I can see a little icon down in the bottom left, which looks like we are recording from another source. Fantasy is the genre, and it's something so dear to my heart. And what we're looking at today is, I know you're reading your books, and there are 6 books across the course, and some people might have been reading other books that I would have loved to have included, like Mortal Engines. I would have loved to have put it in here. How about William Goldman's The Princess Bride, one of my favorite books and films of all time. But what we're looking at here is the conventions of fantasy, even in terms of reading as a genre, with genre approaches to literature, and writing. Why do we do that? Because I'm not trying to teach you to think about teaching an individual book. We're thinking about approaches to reading and writing and motivation as a whole.
Excuse me, 6 books? Isn't it 5 genres or genre, or how do you say
it? Damon. Matt Damon, isn't it? For this, we've got 6 books across this one single genre, haven't we? Genre.
Oh, I thought you meant. Oh, sorry. I was thinking about
totally,
the oral exams.
Oh, I see. You're thinking back to the no. The oral exams, you'll be able to then choose.
It's 5 genre where. In this course.
Basically, yes.
Okay.
And I've divided it up as genre approaches to literature, and the reason for that is because then you're exploring texts, formats, conventions, and that I think is a better key into sort of how to teach books as well, and literature. My personal approach and opinion. I know that there are lots of fantasy lovers out there. There'll be lots of potterers, and I don't know how many people have read A Song of Fire and Ice and Fire. The beginning is a fantasy, just a few quick words on it. They start in things like ancient and Near East, Middle Eastern culture, the Babylonian and linked Sumerian myth of creation, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, is a fantastic voyage, episodic. It includes the creation story of Marduk slaying the dragon Tiamat, and we can trace back a lot of these sort of stories, and we'll talk about the difference between stories and plots as we go along here a little bit today. We'll touch on it, back to ancient Near and Middle Eastern creation myths and oral traditions. Ovid, later in Hellenic, Greek, and Latin culture, picks up with Metamorphoses, which is another creation story and myth with lots of fantastical elements and giants, but basically another run on the creation stories from Gilgamesh and the Bible. In the 19th century, starting from first published in 1811 in English, 1001 Arabian Nights, the Arabian Nights with Aladdin and Sinbad, continues this Middle Eastern and Arabic tradition of storytelling. We also have other famous elements that we can think of in terms of fantasy, Icelandic sagas and Beowulf, which heavily we know influenced J.R. Tolkien, who was a specialist linguist in this, particularly fascinated by Norse culture. You think of Beowulf influencing fantasy stories with its sort of Nordic settings. Similarly, Arthurian legend. And over on the right there, we've got like a picture of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's spelt wrong. Predictive text, that's what I'll blame. You can see already this sort of this knightly character on a horse, and hey, what's fantasy about if it's not about, some sort of knight or a paladin or a hero? And in the early modern period, you can think of also Shakespeare. Midsummer Night's Dream is a very good example of sort of fantastical setting with fantastical creatures, and of course we've got those elements as well of fairies, and there's Oberon and Titania, the fairy king and queen, and the fairy realm, the old magic, Queen Mab in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Beautiful surviving frontispiece over there from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which was also rewritten by, of course, none other than J.R.R. Tolkien. Sort of waxing a little bit lyrical because I know that quite a few of you do like your fantasy, and it's a fascinating area. In 1823, German popular stories he's published, and here's one of the illustrated plates from it, the dragon and his grandmother, and you can see already, you can see sort of the wizards and witches, Frodo Baggins going on over there. This is basically Grimm's fairy tales, which is later published as the Fairy Ring. But a lot happens in the 19th century, where these sort of fairy tales, and then this leads on to, there are other publications, The Princess and the Goblin, and various other things in the early 19th century. But that leads us to Alice. Originally, Alice's Adventures in the Underground. There's two separate words. In the 1860s. At the same time, there's the Darwinian Hymn, a classic movie as well. I don't know if anybody's seen it, called The Water Babies. Another book could have been included on this course. So that's a sort of 19th century is really where we thought about fairy tales. The Brothers Grimm. Charles Perrault is a great collector of tales. Obviously, there's is it Bjørnson and Moe up in Norway as well with their collections of Norse tales. In the 20th century here, you can see the billboard for 1939, Wizard of Oz, the movie. But The Wizard of Oz from 1900 by L. Frank Baum is an important point at the start of the century. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Good. Do beg my pardon. The reading list, you've got copy that I specified has both for the same price. You could be reading just one story quite happily out of that because it might be more than enough for you. And you're very free to use whatever version you'd like to. You might think about combining with the Tim Burton film, and there are so many good illustrated versions of Alice in Wonderland. I'll try and bring some in if I can next week. Peter and Wendy, an early Edwardian tale from 1911, gives us Peter Pan. As you can see, there's like really developing a pace. And of course, we've got classics, which we could have talked about here, and you could still talk about if you want to when you go to your oral exam. Always happy to discuss one of my favorite writers, not because he's a great writer, just because I love Middle Earth. I'll never forget landing at in New Zealand, and it just says "Welcome to Middle Earth" shortly after the Peter Jackson films. 1937, The Hobbit, after stories told to his son Christopher. Then The Lord of the Rings, and of course, the Chronicles of Narnia develop at that time. These really sort of underscore modern fantasy. We can think about slightly more modernized and politically aware fantasy in the Earthsea cycle, written by Ursula Le Guin, and that's originally in the 60s. Well worth checking out as well, and that's often on course readings as you go through English up to English 4. It's not on yours, Louise, Gura, and Marlena this term, but it's on another group who are doing stuff. Then you go into the 21st century, and really, when I say 21st, works at the end of the 20th, which really sort of hit big, and it's Potter. There's an example of some of the original artwork. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze again. No, I'm not. Of the Hogwarts Express, and then it to some degree. Excuse me. Always doing well. Song of Ice and Fire, which became television's probably the most watched television program of all time, Game of Thrones. A picture here from Midsummer Night's Dream there, of the fairy realm. But we're focusing on not just teaching and looking at individual texts, we're going to apply them, but we're looking at sort of genre conventions, which we've already discussed for fairy tales and for Gothic as well. So I'm looking on at page 11, slide 7, and there are very firm conventions for fantasy in terms of subject. So you've got good versus evil as a subject, not as a theme, which is very strong. Often in case of it could be, as I've written there, war. You've got a quest, and we'll look at the form of fantasy, and quest or portal quest is one of them, and it's a classic sort of version of a plot, isn't it? You can think of the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book of the Lord of the Rings, as a quest. You've got the Fantastic Voyage. Again, you can think of the Epic of Gilgamesh as a quest after the Elixir of Eternal Life, and a Fantastic Voyage as well. We've got castaway narratives, war, what's called a maturation plot, or rites of passage, or Bildungsroman, where a youngster goes through some sort of journey and a process. The journey can be seen as a sort of symbolic of that growing up. In terms of themes, because that's really just subject, what it's about. Sometimes the form of the plot could be what it's about as well. You often would get very solid and straightforward themes that repeat, such as good always triumphs over evil, the theme of the fellowship, we're stronger together, or friendship, the trials of friendship, which often go together with a sort of rites of passage, Bildungsroman. A typical theme of fantasy is the one of fate versus free will. Do we have a choice, or are we left to our destiny? You could also link in with ideas of prophecy that appear in the Gothic and also reappear in fantasy quite strongly. And then, of course, they tend to repeat the themes of sort of, I pointed at Sir Gawain in the Green Knight there, of a medieval romance, knightly quests to destroy evil monsters, the honor of fighting in battle, of dying in battle, particularly if you're a Viking, perhaps, and then love plots as well, sort of focused on kind of courtly love. There's a lot of medievalism coming through in sort of fantasy fiction. So our settings, which are one of the important points about fantasy, is in terms of building out from fairy tales, they normally have immersive, very strong settings, and those settings typically might be medieval worlds, pastoral worlds, castles, dark forests, mines, etc. You can see the link to the sort of the moodiness and the mood of the Gothic. But they are normally in what's called high fantasy, like the Lord of the Rings, very described in realistic detail. We can also have settings akin to Sinbad, the ancient world, and another typical thing is, as we can see maybe in the Lord of the Rings, is the end of an era or age or world. Also dying worlds might sort of add into those sort of settings. So we've got the conventional settings. We'll have a look at why they're not always the same, because they're certainly not the same for Alice in Wonderland, which is more of a sort of bizarre fantasy. Characters, again, the characters of medieval romance, hero. Some argue that all stories are based on a hero. We might have a look at that later. A dark lord or evil tyrant, ruler, usurper. The commoner, who's really of royal blood. The chosen one, the one the prophets speak about. The kindly older mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi perhaps there in Star Wars, the wizard, Frodo my boy. And then we have, of course, the fantastical creatures, dragons, giants and monsters. And then another very strong element is the other races as a sort of otherness or racial element to fantasy, which a lot of people then say why it's so appealing and motivating to children who are growing up and transitioning. Not only are they going through this kind of journey as well, but they also find it easy to identify with the otherness, just like Gothic as a style today still sort of determines who you are as being other, as being not normative. Fantasy also appeals very, very strongly to young adults and to teens and tweens, right the way down. Types of plots, which we're going to work a bit more with plot later, aren't we? We're talking about setting today. We've got quest. There are different sort of theories of plot that we could look at. Here are some that are taken from there's the classic 3 or 4 plots which we might look at. There's the 7 stories, but here if we look at quest, adventure, pursuit plot, rescue plot is a common sort of trope or convention, as is escape. There's the maturation plot, which is the Bildungsroman, the sort of the aging plot, and of course a love plot. Perspective in fantasy. You can think of a Game of Thrones if you read. That's the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire series that the TV series is named after. It changes perspective every chapter between what is like an ensemble cast of characters. That's a very sort of modern way of looking at fantasy. It allows a lot of detail and sort of cycles around some of the characters, featuring on 2 or 3 main plot lines and perspectives or narratives, but also involving lots of others. However, you've got some traditional third person, sometimes omniscient narrator, which can be intrusive, which is typical of sort of 19th century narration, where the narrator is like a person and likes to comment on everything, but has moved towards limited third person, which is where it is narrated third person by somebody else, but you don't really know who that is. They don't have a clear identity, so you can't tell the difference between the authorial and the narratorial voice. And then it's even gone into and might be framed in, you can have a frame story where you have a first person narrative. They're traditionally past tense narratives that you can find present tense more today. Here's a story from Arabian Nights. It's the genie in the bottle, the merchant and the genie, pronounced genie. So there's a well-known taxonomy, or sort of basically division of fantasy. That's a lovely illustration there from a illustrated copy of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. That's Aslan there, and the Ice Queen. So you've got these typical sort of ways of defining what fantasies are. It's quite interesting to look at this. You've got the portal quest. And Narnia is a really good example of that straight up, isn't it? They go through the wardrobe and they go into another land and immediately get tied up in some kind of adventure where they have a quest to complete. And this sort of idea of going through some sort of hidden portal into another reality is obviously you can see that in Alice, can't you? Or even going through the window and flying with Peter to Never Neverland in Peter and Wendy. You've got the immersive fantasy, where you go into a fantasy world, very detailed, and the setting is very strongly described. Say, for example, like Lord of the Rings, and it seems to have a life all of its own and never refers to a world outside of it. And that's a sort of straight down the line immersive fantasy, whereas an intrusion fantasy could happen in two ways. But whereas in the Portal Quest you go through some sort of portal into another world, maybe like Gulliver in Gulliver's Travels, who knows? Fantasy could be like, for example, in Ransom Riggs' Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, where the fantasy world intrudes on reality. And so you have this sort of interplay between the fantastical and the real. Liminal fantasies are far less common. I hope you can still see my screen. And we can discuss those later. That's where you think everything is absolutely normal, and yet there are strange distortions on what is real or true. So just going to build on this sort of like conventions here. This is the picture of 19th century early fantasy text. You can see the sort of medieval setting and the journey to an island of Angelica. You've got these sort of common sort of conventions. The battle of good versus evil seems to be one of them that kind of dominates most fantasy works. You've got the character of the hero, which seems central, and some would argue central to all plots. Also got the figure of the Dark Lord, which certainly seems to be a recurrent trope. If you think of Sauron in Middle Earth and the Lord of the Rings, but even if you go through most fantasy worlds, the devil or Satan seems to be sort of almost portrayed in the figure of a Dark Lord, an evil power. Got the quest convention as normally as a plot or as a subject itself, and normally, obviously, in fantasy worlds, because they are returned to medievalism, which could be spelled with an A, that would be the same A that's in Daemon. They tend to point back, like the Gothic, to a sort of medieval world of sort of romance and knights and sort of the past, but from a safe distance. There's this sort of fun adventure from contemporary times. And so magic is true as opposed to science. There are normally magical elements. And there's a very strong racial element to fantasy as well, this idea of otherness and races, and so it tends to explore issues of otherness, identity, and diversity in fantasy. And there are more conventions. There's the King of the Golden River, early 1840s work of fantasy. You can see this sort of mythical world with a sort of fairy-like characters involved, beautiful illustrations there. Got the idea of prophecy or a curse, just like in the Gothic, that can be linked together with a chosen one or messiah-like figure. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Frank Herbert's Dune as an immersive science fiction fantasy with Paul Muad'Dib as the messiah figure. He's the chosen one. The convention of the mysterious or magical object, which is quite cool. You'd have to think of the Ring of Power, of course, in the Lord of the Rings, but this is a recurring feature. The Dark Lord quest, magic, and medievalism races. So if we look back to Gothic, you can see we've got this sort of element of supernatural beings and monsters, the decaying setting, curses or prophecies, heroes, heroines, damsels in distress, intense emotion. are there that many differences, and how does the fantastical worlds differ from the Gothic? The setting could include decaying settings, of course, but the detail of the entire world has been built out. We might have elements of curses and supernatural beings, of course, but we also have other races in a more complete world picture rather than this single sort of intrusion of the supernatural that you get in the Gothic. The figure of the damsel in distress is often completely inverted or lost. Very often in fantasy, not always, but in a modern fantasy like Stardust, then the damsel in distress is often empowered and has a integral role in the development, progression, and resolution of the plot. And this idea of intense emotion as well is lost in fantasy in favor of a degree of realism that gives it this detailed and rich setting, so we can suspend our disbelief and go along in that journey. Going to come back to, I've just been discussing and mentioning a few of these bits. We'll come back to that a bit later. I'm going to hop over genre features. This is about 1423. And we'll come back to that later, particularly when we talk about plot. Descriptive writing, I'm going to have a look at setting today. Now, you've already started off. Here's a fantastic work of Gothic fairy fantasy. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Well worth a visit. Beautiful BBC 7-part adaptation. So I said when we look at setting here, this is one of the original drawings from Alice in Wonderland. How to establish setting, or what to look for when reading, and then what to think about when doing it, when you're writing actively. You're thinking about encouraging students to think about, read, and analyze genres, or recognize genre conventions, and then also use them to create their own texts. And this is what I'd like you to do in about 5 minutes once we get through this section. When you set the scene, it's as well to set the scene early. That's one of the establishing rules. When we look at our 6 examples, I'll see if I can get through and have a look at some of them in a minute. The scene might be set very, very quickly indeed. That's very effective. I think if we look at the example from Northern Lights with Lyra, almost within the first sentence, we understand that there's a specific detail, the daemon that Kristen picked up on there, which is very unfamiliar and yet familiar at the same time, and sets a very strong sense of place and scene with very specific and unfamiliar detail. This work with detail, where it might be exotic, unusual settings that tie us in very quickly, things that we don't recognize, or it could be very specific details that are picked out as well that can very strongly help us establish setting. There could be details of time, or there could be details of place, or there could be names. Other schools of thought say that you need to be selective with details as well, rather than just laying on too many details thick, that sometimes a well-chosen detail is more important rather than using 3, 4, 5 adjectives consistently. Creating mood is a very difficult thing to break down, but we can see in some of our pieces that the tone was kind of playful or ironic, whereas in some of them they're quite enhance atmosphere straight away. Often we'll have a look at some of them quickly. This can be helped by sensory description, as we saw with the Gothic as well, with those early passages that gave us a very strong sense of character. Sensory description is going to look at our sensory input, and so we'll think about what we see, colors, smell, sounds, all these kind of details that give us a very rich and vivid picture of a world around us. And most fantasy, when you think about things like The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, their success are built on this super rich detail and a level of world creation where they're even sort of smithing their own swords, and all the clothes are made with traditional methods. That seems to sort of mimic the richness of the description and the world building and fantasy plots. Tying setting to plot is a very effective way of setting the scene very, very quickly. We can see here the significance of items, objects, even characters and places, whether it be a castle in the beginning of a Gothic tale that is going to later feature in the plot. When we look at, I think one group we're looking at Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I was watching Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory only on Sunday night in a state of adoration. The chocolate bar gives a very strong foreshadowing of what is to come in the plot. We can see these in quite a few of our descriptions. If we went back, we talked last time about appealing to this through literal language. Also, we can do that through feelings and interior life. Sentence length also creates a certain amount of mood as kind of vocative verbs. We looked at precision with sentence length, choosing verbs, adjectives, and nouns. And then description as well can follow the camera, which is something we'll work with next week as well, where we think about panoramas and long shots, how a close-up might ask us to give details of skin, of hair, of all sorts of very sort of specific close-up details, whereas then we might be able to pan out and look at setting from a completely different perspective. And description characterizes realism. It's like this realism that we find in fantasy that really sells us this sort of, particularly the immersive world. Even in, say, for example, the Chronicles of Narnia, where it's quite believable, the world itself, and it's sold in quite intense detail. And of course, we touched on and talked about before uses of simile, metaphor, hyperbole, alliteration and sounds and sounding together, which we talked about. We also had a very strong element of pathetic fallacy in the Gothic, where even the settings might have feelings. However, this perhaps figurative element, strangely, are not always as strong, particularly hyperbole and personification in fantasy, as it has this reliance on a sort of descriptive realism, which favors very often figurative language. And you'll find that, for example, with Tolkien's writing, that it's almost entirely bereft of narratorial or authorial sort of metaphor or simile. The only metaphor or simile that appears is within the dialogue and speech of the characters in the immersive world, which to many of us became sort of quite believable. On the other hand, something that may well happen a lot is symbolism. And just as we saw in the Gothic, how fog, mist, mysterious figures, these sort of tropes or conventions, the castle, the monastery, seem to have a strong symbolic value. It says there, symbolism, a symbol represents something else within the textual world and is not always understood by the reader. So symbol can be used quite strongly in fantasy. The other symbolism, when it's built out, we'll talk about illusion in another context. When you have a full system of symbolism at text level, then that is called allegory, and it should be understood by the intended reader. What do we mean by this? Well, in The Lord of the Rings, for example, and quite a few children's fantasies, fantasy seems to be a way of dealing with war. Pan's Labyrinth is a very good example in the 2011 is it 2011? I think it's earlier, 2006, a film where the magic world intrudes upon the real to explain war for a child. But The Lord of the Rings is kind of like a battle versus good and evil that is allegorically, as in through a system of symbolism, kind of intended to represent the battle between the allies and the Nazi Third Reich in the Second World War. So it could be highly symbolic, but allegory means there's an entire symbolism that works at a text level. Just aware that we're up on time. I've done very well getting all that in about half an hour. Very intense, I do understand. I'm going to ask you to go away and think in task 2 about writing. I'm just going to point out some of the bits maybe that we could pick out from here. You can see here, first of all, Lyra and her demon moved through the darkening hall, taking care to step to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. Just this specific detail, the capital letter on hall, meaning it has some sort of extra significance. The demon, or daemon, depending on how we're going to pronounce it, somehow changes the world in a sort of liminal way. It's somehow different, and it captures our interest straight away. We have the darkening hall, so we have a sensory description, though it's not really gothic in the sense that it's not sort of scary, and it's not using sort of very obvious gothic conventions. Then have very literal, a lot of literal language to describe what's going on. The 3 great tables that around the length of the hall were laid already. The silver and the glass, little light there was, and the long benches catching, pulled out ready for the guests. So we've got a very sort of literal description, beautiful illustration over here as well. Portraits of former masters hung high up in the gloom along the walls. Again, the sensory detail of the gloom, of the light, and the juxtaposition of these two. But very little figurative language at all, and a very sort of there's suspense in the mood here as well. We're wondering what's going to happen. We've got this feeling that there is action. Lyra reached the dais and looked back at the open kitchen door, and seeing no one, stepped up beside the high table. The places here were laid with gold, not silver, and the 14 seats were not oak benches, but mahogany chairs with velvet cushions. Specific detail coming in, all literal language as well. Lyra stopped beside the master's chair and flicked the biggest glass gently with a fingernail. The sound rang clearly through the hall, and there seems to be almost a sense of suspense has been created in terms of the mood of something about to happen. I'm intrigued, and this sort of foreshadowing of something with the sound ringing through the hall, a bit of sensory evocation, but very little figurative language, but quite a lot of detail put into that world description. I think I probably need to move on. I can look at some of the others as well very quickly. This Stardust, the town of Wall, stands today as it has stood for 600 years on a high ridge of granite amidst a small forest woodland. The idea of the forest, but it seems like we get a lot of information in very, very short amount of time here. Feels like it's going to be a fairy tale to begin with, and it's a deliberate play on it. The houses of Wall are square and old, built of grey stone with dark slate roofs and high chimneys. Note the simple realism that's being used here, and the detail with plenty of sensory descriptions, colour, and dimensions, taking advantage of every inch of space on the rock. The houses lean into each other, built one upon the next, with here and there a bush or tree growing out of the side of a building. There is one road from Wall, a winding track rising sharply up from the forest, where it is lined with rocks and small stones. Followed far enough south, out of the forest, the track becomes a real road paved with asphalt. Followed further, the road gets larger, is packed at all hours with cars and trucks rushing from city to city. Eventually the road takes you to London, but London is a whole night's drive from Wall. And here all of a sudden we're in the modern world. So we get a sort of transition, all quite literally described with a good level of detail and attention to detail that sort of bridges what feels like almost a fairy tale beginning to modern day London in the end. But enough of me. I'm going to need to get you into your final tasks for today. And I want you to bring this with you and keep this with you for next week when we do come back. Because we're going to continue with reading, analysing, thinking about genre and conventions, and writing next week at the course.
I have another
Meet.
question. Oh, I have another
Yeah.
question.
Do it.
For the book Northern Lights.
Yes.
Often when they are in dialogue, they
Yes.
use the wrong tense. Instead of
Right.
I ran away, I run away, and I thought, is it because I don't know
Yes.
why is that?
So it's matched in the. Have you seen the Golden Compass?
Nope.
No. Okay. So Lyra
Don't give the ending away.
spoiler alert. Lyra and what's the name of the boy who's her friend? He is from he's from a lower class family, isn't he?
Yes.
So he speaks not proper, and he says instead of saying I ran, he says I run, which is.
Is it Peter? No, Roger. Yeah, Roger.
Roger. Yes. Too many boys who are foiled in fantasy stories at the moment. So they, that's done well in the Golden Compass as well. They're sort of Lyra's from sort of a posh family, isn't she, with Lord Asriel as her father.
Mm-hmm.
And so she speaks nicely.
Not everyone knows that though.
But she deliberately dumbs down to be with Egyptians and to be with Roger as well. So that's typical dialectal language. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would say that as well.
Because they have you were awaiting, and they have a, and then a hyphen. No, hva heter det? Bindestrek. Is it a hyphen?
Hyphen. Perfect.
Hyphen.
Bindestrek, yeah.
And then a coming. So they're.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's typical of spoken English, and that's typical of Northern English, and it's typical of quite a few dialects. Country English, Southwest British as well.
Yes, she's from Oxford, and then they're in London.
Yes, they're supposed to be posh, but out in Oxford as well, which is out towards the country, you still get like what you might see as the lower classes or the country folk. They would all speak like that, and I do as well. So you can speak properly, or you can speak, how you normally speak as well. So that's a good representation. And Lyra sort of dumbs down, doesn't she? Because she doesn't. She's good at book learning. I think
she wants to be a gypsy.
She emotionally sort of feels a connection, with Egyptians. Yeah, absolutely. So that's absolutely deliberate. Task. I know we've only got 20 minutes, but really it's a sort of interactive task for task 2, which is to thinking about what we're doing here. It's not a great work of art. I'd like you to go into your groups and think about writing, just like we've been doing. We've been looking at first reading and then writing with oral interweaved in both exercises, thinking about how you would open or set the scene in let's say an opening paragraph, because that's what we've had so far in a fantasy story. We've sort of done this a little bit with a fairy tale, but how are we going to spend more time creating a believable scene early on in a fantasy world by using more description and more detail and a degree of literal language and realism, sensory description, to create mood. What I'd really like you to do in your groups is to just have a go at it without any particular need for it being good. The idea is to look at conventions of a fantasy world, so you can think of a setting, maybe include a character. I'm sure you'll have plenty of ideas yourself, and just have a go at using a couple of obvious conventional fantasy characters, possibly a setting and some description, and see if you can produce a short paragraph in the last 20 minutes. You can finish that off and put that into the folder as well, individually or in groups if you like, and I'll be commenting on everything that's up there before we come back for the course week next week. But until then, I'm going to reconvene at 1500 for those of you who still can. And see, I'll be back for questions and goodbyes for the day at 1500.